Thanks everybody for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Corey Hess, and I'm a fifth-year doctoral student at Ball State University, and I'm also the current chair of the Prevention and Promotion Pillar for SAS, which, as you probably know, is the student-led organization that's part of Division 17. And so one of the central goals of our pillar is to promote self-care among graduate students. And we are really fortunate today to have two excellent speakers with us. We have Dr. Yamini Belair and Craig Deacon, who were involved in creating and facilitating a self-care group called COPE. And so they're going to talk to us today a little bit about the development of that group and what it was like implementing that group, and to give us some suggestions as far as how other people might go about implementing a similar program at their university. So our hope was that this webinar today could serve as a training guide for people who might be interested in starting something like this at their universities. And we want to thank those of you who are joining us live today. Also, just so you know, this will be available sometime soon on the SCP website. And so this will also be available for viewing at a future date if you want to get more information later. And so as we're going through today, please feel free to type in questions through the question and answer feature. And at the end, we'll save some time for discussion, and I'll ask any questions that you guys have to Craig and Yamini. So I want to just take a minute now to introduce Craig and Yamini. This is all about me. We can kind of skip over that. I already introduced myself. So we have Dr. Yamini Belair. She is currently clinical assistant professor of psychology at Indiana University Kokomo, and you can read about her professional and personal interests there. And we're also joined by Craig Deacon, who is currently on internship. He is a clinical health psychology intern at the VA in Georgia there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them to give their presentation for you guys today. And again, just thanks for tuning in.
So I'll get us started. So thank you everyone for attending this webinar. So today, Craig and I will be sharing our experiences of developing COPE, which is a self-care group specifically for psychology graduate students. We'll be sharing how we developed and implemented this group at Ball State University. And our hope is that COPE can be adopted in other graduate programs around the US. And the goal for COPE is for students to engage, or to encourage students to engage in some regular self-care. And the final goal is to help students avoid any burnout and graduate on time. So there are several goals that COPE can help achieve, but the main goal is to encourage self-care. So there is no denying that graduate students in psychology are very stressed out. Their personal resources are stretched real thin because we wear a lot of hats as graduate students. We have classes, we have graduate assistantships, we go on for internships and practicums, and in the process, it makes us more vulnerable to experiencing burnout and stress, in some cases depression and even suicidality. So there's a major need for self-care programs like COPE to be implemented at an institutional level within psychology departments to provide that additional support to graduate students so that they don't feel alone, they don't feel they don't feel drained, which might prevent them from graduating on time. So we delved into some research on the wellness and mental health of graduate students, and the the research is very clear on the fact that a lot of graduate students are experiencing a lot of stress and stress-related issues that is negatively impacting their emotional experiences, their emotional well-being rather, and academic performance overall. About 46.3% in this study by Abel and Smith in 2012, they showed that about 46.3% of students feel really overwhelmed in graduate school. The APA has also done a lot of studies. In 2009, they found that psychology graduate students report high levels of anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts. Now, most of the research out there is based on like medical students, law students, but very little is done on counselors in training. And compared to a lot of other fields, we do experience a lot more stress and burnout because we are helpers and we engage in work that can be pretty emotionally and physically straining on a day-to-day basis. So overall, the research is pretty clear on the fact that there is a lot that needs to be done for graduate students, especially in psychology, and there is a very significant need for self-care programs like COPE. So now a little bit of a history on the COPE program. Now, I was in a class at Ball State with Dr. Iges daughter, and the class was on program evaluation, and our group that consisted of Hugh Kwan and another student, we kind of came up with a paper or a proposal that in which we kind of designed a mock program that aimed to enhance self-care among graduate students in our counseling psychology program. And we decided that we have this really detailed manual, so maybe it's time to kind of put our idea into practice and actually run the group in our program. So with the support of the department and Dr. Iges daughter, we also conducted a very detailed needs assessment. So we gave out questionnaires. We also did a couple of interviews with our students. And we found that, yes, there is a need for a self-care program in our department. And though we talk about it in classes and we're encouraged to do it, but there is nothing from like an institutional perspective which is organized and structured where you're kind of encouraged to engage in self-care in a way that is very structured, and there's very little like support for self-care. So we put together this overview of the anticipated outcomes in the short term and the long term. That's the diagram you're seeing on the screen, and the kind of inputs that might be required in order to help run the COPE program. So the inputs were our activities. So we put together psychoeducational activities. That's something that Craig and I will be talking about today. There's also a lot of experiential activities every week that we put together. And then, of course, the social support aspect is the most important part of COPE, where you sit together with your peers, you discuss things like self-care and ways to engage in self-care, and that helps reduce things like loneliness and increase social support overall. And from a staffing perspective, our plan was to encourage doctoral level counseling students that are in the program to kind of take a leadership role and help with recruitment and help run this 10 session program in our department. And then we also have had a supervisor, Dr. Iges daughter, who is a licensed psychologist and a professor in our department. And we would meet with her on a weekly basis to discuss our reactions and kind of get support and some supervision from her as well. So as far as output, we were hoping that this program helps our students develop coping skills, stress reduction, and also personal development, social support, and in the long term, we were hoping that this helps them apply the skills that they've learned in COPE to their own clients that are dealing with stress or burnout. So there were those other advantages to COPE as well. So the intermediate outcomes were the immediate outcomes that we were hoping to get from the COPE program. So we were hoping to get them, help them develop coping skills, social support, and help them be more prepared to handle stress in a way that is healthy. And then the long-term program outcomes is to help them complete their degrees, help them get jobs, help them reduce any symptoms of depression or anxiety that they might have. So based on our needs assessment, so again, we kind of used questionnaires and interviews, and we gathered data. And this data was used, and in addition to the literature review that we conducted, we put together some program goals for COPE. So the first one was to help them develop skills to kind of deal effectively with the stress of graduate school. Another big goal was to help them get some peer social support, that they're not alone in this process. Because graduate school, sometimes, like when you're working on your dissertation or your thesis, or you're in several classes, you feel like you're pretty lonely, especially if you don't have a very supportive cohort, or you have a very small cohort that there aren't a lot of connections. So COPE can provide that additional social support that you might need. And then helping them improve work-life balance, because one of the major things we saw in our needs assessment was that a lot of students will push aside things that they enjoy doing, life things like hanging out with their friends, or calling friends and family, or doing things that are fun, or that help them cope with life, because they have so much to do as far as work is considered. So helping them get more of that healthier work-life balance was also a major program goal for us. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that they develop skills not only for themselves, but things that they can use as clinicians in their either practicum or their internship with their clients. So that was another outcome that we were hoping to get from our COPE program. So overall, COPE program turned out to be a 10-session program. Each session was about an hour long. And then in the rest of today's presentation, we'll provide an overview of the format and each session, and how we kind of went about each session.
Great. And so I'll talk a little bit about putting together just kind of the front end of the COPE program. First thing we needed to decide and figure out with all of the people that were interested is when and where to meet. As part of the student affiliates of 17, we also tried to do an online program as well, because there was a lot of interest from graduate students kind of from a lot of different universities on how to do that. So we did a combination of in-person meetings, online meetings, through Skype or another video format. And then also we tried a Blackboard where it was more of a self-paced course rather than a course that met every week consistently. What we found is that there was a lot of interest in online groups just because of the flexibility, being able to meet at times when people wouldn't necessarily want to come to campus, times when maybe we had people from that were living in a different city or from a different state who wanted to join the program but wouldn't have been able to do so because of transportation difficulties or timing difficulties. And then the Blackboard format also gave people an opportunity to do things at their own pace rather than needing to meet once a week and find the time to carve out just kind of consistently at a specific time, which could be very helpful for people that are new parents or that don't have as flexible of schedules as other people. What we found is that even though there was a lot of interest in the online formats, and with the Blackboard format, it was really difficult to develop a sense of cohesion and develop that social support that comes with the in-person program. It was a little bit more effective with the video format, but with the Blackboard format, it was really difficult to get the same amount of same amount of social support and same amount of consistency. So if at all possible, I think the in-person format worked a little bit better. Now, again, doing that means a lot of accommodations and trying to figure out schedules. So when possible, we tried to do it during the work week at a time when most of the participants would be able to come in and it wouldn't interfere with having to come back from off campus to kind of butt right up to another class or another obligation that they had. But one semester it was just too difficult to find a time during the week, so the group decided together to meet on Sundays, which can just be, I think, part of the nature of this program is that everyone is in graduate school and understands the busyness of life and the responsibilities, and so trying to be as flexible as possible with each other and find a time that really works is important. As Yamini said, the classes were an hour long, or the meetings were an hour long. We had handouts and multimedia materials for almost every meeting, so being able to provide information that people could take home with them and think about. A lot of times I would send out web links or links to handouts or other resources depending on the topic for the week as well. And then another thing that I found was helpful in the program was to have everybody kind of set a goal every week about something they wanted to do related to their own self-care. And that was helpful, just kind of figuring out if they wanted to continue on with the theme from the week or if there was another self-care goal that was important to them. Often people had set a goal the week before that they were still trying to reach and we would do some troubleshooting around that. So giving some flexibility to people that were part of the program was an important part of it. And as Yamini said as well, the peer support framework is a crucial part of the COPE program. And so it gives people an opportunity to feel validated by their peers, to get the sense that there's a safe place to talk about their concerns. And because it wasn't a counseling group, right, this is a psychoeducation program, it was important to try to balance having people share about the things that they were going through as part of their graduate school program and to feel validated and supported in that without it turning into a group counseling session. And so we were always mindful of just that balance, and group members, because they're counseling or clinical psychology or school psychology students, were aware of that as well. And so finding that balance worked really well as long as we were kind of intentional about it at the beginning. Another kind of great aspect of this program is that people were able to use their experiences that they were having in graduate school, in their clinical work, and with their courses and with their peer supports and experiences, and bring that into the group as well. So often we would have topics where people would bring in their own resources related to the topic, or we would start discussing one thing and someone had a really good knowledge in that area and they were able to share and provide a little bit extra for the people that were in the group with us. So that was really important, and I think a really neat aspect of this specific type of group is that everyone is bringing in their own skills and their own clinical knowledge that can be helpful in troubleshooting and to make sense of some of the information. Another key part of this was to validate the stress that people were going through while also promoting change. So we didn't want this to turn into a program, at least in the meetings where I was facilitating, it seemed that sometimes people would come in with everything that they were dealing with from the week, and we didn't want it to turn into a complaint session. So trying to figure out how to validate that stress with each other without while still supporting that change and moving forward and making progress. And so incorporating the different topic for the week and whatever their current concern was could be a really helpful way of doing that and moving things forward. And then I think the last thing that was really important with the group is to acknowledge toward the front end that everybody is going to do self-care a little bit differently. Many of the people that attended the groups would come in and they would start to get frustrated because the topic of the week wasn't something that was as relevant to them, or they didn't feel like they were doing it well. And so encouraging them to figure out what worked well for them and to pursue those goals for self-care rather than comparing themselves to peers that were in the group or to the way they thought they should be doing self-care. So it was really important to find that balance and to talk about that pretty explicitly too, just kind of throughout the program, to make sure that people were finding the things that actually did work for them and to reduce their stress, while also kind of setting those goals that made sense.
So in the first week of our COPE group, the goal was to discuss self-care. So we began with the basics, the introductions, getting to know each other. We also did an icebreaker where each participant would write down their goals, their hopes for COPE, the group as a whole. And then if they had any fears participating in the group, then they would write those down as well. And then the leaders we went through each of the goals and the fears of the participants. Now, these cards were all anonymous. So we didn't know who had written which goals or fears, but what this helped us do is figure out that there was a commonality. Everyone had similar goals, everyone had similar fears as well. So this kind of helped us start developing some cohesion in the group. It helped us start developing that sense of common humanity in the group, because they felt that, yes, I'm not alone in my hopes and my fears. So that kind of helped us break the ice a little bit. We also talked about, we gave them an overview of the program. We discussed group rules, some confidentiality. We also had some additional goal setting for the group as well. So in week 1, we just did a lot of groundwork to help them get more comfortable, help them understand what COPE is about, and also get their kind of ideas of, things that they might want to do in groups, so that we can also honor their requests. So in the second week, we focused on developing a very specialized self-care plan. Like Craig said, everyone's self-care looks different. So we helped them create this plan for their body and mind. We gave them a handout that helps them create a very focused self-care plan. We also developed, we kind of discussed how self-care is not selfish. So you're not being mean, or you're not ignoring your work because you're taking some time off to engage in self-care. And sometimes that tends to be one of the biggest barriers to engaging in self-care, is because they feel that it's either a waste of time, or I could be doing something else, or there's so much else that I need to do, so self-care is not as important. So we discussed some of the potential barriers. We also identified ways to overcome them, so that we also normalize the fact that it's going to be hard to take out some time from their busy schedule to engage in self-care. And we also challenge some of the beliefs around self-care, that it's beliefs like it's selfish, it's a waste of time, I don't have enough time. So, and we kind of bolstered all of this with a lot of tips, helping them develop a very realistic plan. And also we also discussed like basic self-care techniques, like getting enough sleep, getting enough exercise, eating well, discussing some activities where they can find joy, eating healthy. So all of this was covered in week 2. So this again created a kind of structure for them to follow throughout the next 10 weeks, where they could implement their own personalized self-care plan.
The following week, during week 3, we talked about a specific model of stress in order to, again, lay some more foundation, some framework for thinking about the ways that their self-care plans would fit into their day-to-day lives. Most people came in with some sort of foundational knowledge about stress and how the stress response works, and cognitive appraisals and things along those lines. But we wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page, because we couldn't guarantee, based on level of like where people were at in their programs, how new they were to the program, their prior experiences, what they would know. So as part of that stress model, we talked about their current resources for coping with stress, what kinds of stresses they had and different skills they had to deal with those. An important part of this was providing and asking for examples that fit into this model, to start to understand where people's stress responses tend to come in, and to identify some potentially stressful situations that could come up during graduate school that would give them an idea of ways to cope ahead. So starting to think about how they could implement these self-care strategies as things became stressful in graduate school. We also made sure to practice a progressive muscle relaxation as kind of a behavioral way of dealing with stress and the stress response. And then if we had time, depending on the group and depending on how talkative they were, how much we got into different details of the stress model, we talked about sleep hygiene and ways to implement sleep hygiene as an important part of maintaining wellness and health overall. So now we'll look at the stress model that we used as part of the program because it was such an important part of it. And that stress model included looking at external resources, so things like time, money, and how those could impact how we deal with stress. Thinking about the stressor itself. So this was an important part where we had people start to give examples, again, either writing them down anonymously, or I would always come with a couple of just examples either from my own experiences or hypothetical examples that people might face during graduate school, to think about, things that add to stress. And sometimes this was important too, because it provided a framework of thinking about how small stresses over time can really impact our experience in graduate school. Then thinking about personal resources, so personality traits, ways of coping with stress, different coping styles and strategies that people had used in the past. Then we came into appraisal, so how we think about stressors, how we think about our own ability to cope with stressors. And then social supports, so people that have been supportive, and potentially sometimes barriers that come up with social supports for people that aren't in graduate school and may not quite understand as much what we're going through. So figuring out who and how to get social support as needed. So then in the context of a specific example, we would walk through a specific stressor that somebody had faced, external resources that they had used or personal resources, the support that they got, how they were thinking about the situation, and then what they actually did in that situation to cope with it. And then we followed up with, how did that go? So what was the outcome? Did their stress seem to subside? Did they feel less burned out? Did they feel they handled things effectively? How was their health impacted, either positively or negatively, depending on the way that they coped with the situation? So as we went then, we used this same model as we talked about the new skills we would bring in every week. And so we would relate the skill to the model, see where it would tie into the stress model. And I think another part of this was that, I tend to use more mindfulness and ACT-based approaches just in general. And so talking about how we can develop some distance between ourselves and the way we think about stressors, ways that we can do things that are important to us, so based on values and acting in ways that are consistent with our values, and then giving ourselves some distance between how we get tied up in stress and how we get tied up in thinking about stress. And again, I encourage people to think about situations that they were comfortable sharing in the group, making sure that it was nothing too personal. And during this, when we were sharing specific examples, reminding people about confidentiality and the importance of sharing things within the group and not sharing those outside of the group as well.
So week 4 was mindfulness. So as we all know, mindfulness is a very, very powerful tool to help with stress reduction, anxiety management. It helps with reducing symptoms of depression, and there's tons and tons and tons of research on the effectiveness and the impact of mindfulness on mental health. So we felt that it was necessary for us to incorporate mindfulness into the COPE program. So mindfulness is the practice or the skill of being purposeful, being in the present moment, and having this non-judgmental present awareness of oneself. So we discussed mindfulness, we gave out handouts, we also watched some videos on mindfulness. And what we stressed during this session was mindfulness is a skill. It's not something that comes naturally to all of us, and it's something that needs to be practiced. It's something that you are encouraged to do at least for 5 to 10 minutes every single day. It doesn't have to be meditation all the time. It could be mindful eating. It could be mindful brushing your teeth. It could be mindful walking. So we kind of discussed different ways that people can practice mindfulness in addition to meditation. And in session, we also went through a mindfulness meditation. So we played a tape that Kabat-Zinn, I think it's on YouTube, where Kabat-Zinn has a guided meditation, and we went through that together. We discussed our reactions to mindfulness. How can mindfulness be difficult to implement? What could be some of the barriers to being mindful in the moment? How can we overcome them? How can we not beat ourselves up for not being able to be very present in and be focused on the present in a way that's purposeful, because it's when we're experiencing anxiety, we're always somewhere in the future. So mindfulness helps us kind of curb that and be in the present moment. So that non-judgmental aspect was something that we really kind of talked about a lot. We discussed that. And we also talked about different apps that you can find in your Google Store or your iPhone apps that you can use to help you with the mindfulness practice. And then at the end of the session, we all kind of agreed to do at least 5 to 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation every night before we go to bed, or any other time during the day that we might feel is best for us to do meditation. So we kind of were keeping each other accountable to engage in some mindfulness practices. And there have been groups where I've done like a mindful eating practice where I would take mandarins into group and we would do a mindful eating exercise. And so there are different ways you can be really creative with mindfulness, and it can be a lot more than just meditation. So that really opened up a lot of options for our participants and really encouraged them to give mindfulness a try.
The next topic we talked about was work-life balance, and this was an interesting one to talk to people about because people tended to have different perceptions of what work-life balance meant. And so we started out just by talking about what does work-life balance mean for each of the group members and how they thought about work-life balance, where they saw their own personal experiences with work-life balance and maybe how that could differ between people. I had learned about a phrase and always brought up to the groups about finding work-life fit more than balance necessarily. So some people who were in the groups would take work-life balance very seriously and thinking about, you needed to have an equal amount of work and life time that you were spending. And part of this was figuring out, at different stages in our careers, there might be times when life takes priority or work takes priority, and it's about what fits best for each of the people individually. And so we talked about how people find that fit for themselves and finding ways to keep the things that are important to them in life outside of work and not letting work be an excuse to have somebody else decide what you should be doing with your time or forcing you to work longer or harder than what's healthy or important to you. So trying to find that balance. We talked about prioritizing. So an important part of graduate school is figuring out the tasks that we need to get done and what our timelines are for those and deadlines, and finding ways to prioritize those as it's important to us, but then also finding time to prioritize our own health and well-being, the people that are important to us, so family members, friends, spouses, children, and really being able to say what's important to me based on my life goals, my work goals, career goals, and finding out how to prioritize those. A key part of prioritizing is also figuring out when to say no. And part of being a graduate student involves thinking about power dynamics and differentials, and also figuring out when is enough on our plates in order to tell people when we can't take on another responsibility, and finding ways to do that successfully without feeling bad about it, without feeling like we've let somebody down, or without thinking that we've not lived up to our potentials. And so talking about saying no and the reality of saying no and normalizing that that's part of developing as a healthy professional was a key part of this group meeting. And we talked about social support and work-life balance. So finding time for social support, giving social support to each other, and then making sure that that was another way that we were incorporating this kind of fit in our lives, that finding balance or finding fit is not about just doing activities for ourselves or for graduate school. It's about finding those relationships that are important to us as well. Me time comes into that too. So again, as Yamini said earlier, when we talked about self-care and introduced self-care, we wanted to make sure people knew that spending time on their self-care and that me time is important too. And different people are going to have different needs depending on their own personalities, but finding that time to spend on ourselves is important and not selfish. And then finally, taking a long-range perspective kind of fits into this work-life balance, work-life fit, and that sometimes we will get things out of whack for a little while, depending on how we're prioritizing our lives or what kind of deadlines are coming up or the things are important. And taking that long range perspective that right now I'm dealing with more stress or taking on a little bit more than I would normally like to as part of my fit and my work-life balance. But long term, I'll be able to take some extra time to do something that's important to me. So take a weekend off to spend with family members or friends, or take time in other self-care activities. So getting out of balance now in order to regain balance later and kind of make up for it at another time. Week 6, the focus was on time management and goal setting. So the first topic within this was talking about multitasking and kind of the inefficiency of multitasking. With graduate school, there are many different hats that we wear, many different responsibilities that we have. And so it's important to figure out how to do things effectively and using our time well, rather than trying to do too many things at the same time. And so the concept of micro switching rather than multitasking came up pretty frequently. And that's just talking to people about how our attention isn't really split between two things. We're switching back and forth kind of rapidly between two different topics or ideas. So we can't really divide that attention, but we use it in different ways. So we talk about kind of the efficiency of task switching versus spending time on undivided attention. Mindfulness came through in this as well. So being able to stay attentive to the present moment without thinking about different things or different tasks that we needed to complete in the future or things that had happened in the past, just putting our attention on one thing at a time. The next part of this, kind of the activity that we would do, is completing a time inventory. So taking a look over the last week and mapping out our time hour by hour. So what did we do from 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, to figure out where time was being used effectively, where we might want to prioritize different things, how we could reorganize our schedules that make more sense with how we work. So some people tend to be morning people and they like to get things done earlier in the morning. Some people tend to prefer working in the afternoon or evenings or even on weekends. And so figuring out, where we were spending our time, ways that we could change up our schedules to better fit with what's important to us or how we work the best. And then finding kind of areas where our time was being sucked away from us that we didn't realize. So things, time spent, on procrastination tactics, or things that weren't really as important as either doing something that was meaningful in our lives or something that was important for school or for our careers. And we talked about short versus long-term goal setting. So as I did these meetings with people, I tended to actually bring this up a little bit sooner and to do SMART goals kind of throughout the time that we spent together in COPE. But this was a time where we had a little bit more time and energy to talk about what are people's long-term career goals versus short-term goals, and then how to prioritize what we take on in response to what our goals are. So finding activities and saying yes to things that were meaningful and were important to us in our careers, rather than trying to do everything in graduate school, because there just isn't enough time for that. And so that was always a meaningful discussion too, was how do people figure out when they're biting off more than they can chew in graduate school versus when are they picking activities that really are important to them and really advance where they want to go in life. And then finally, we spent time talking about procrastination as kind of an avoidance tactic, and how procrastination can add to stress in various different ways. And not just the amount of time that we don't use on the things that are important to us, but then that time tends to be spent worrying and thinking about those tasks that we aren't getting done, and increasing our stress levels because we're not currently getting those tasks done. And so we talked about different ways to help with procrastination. So setting schedules, being in environments that are conducive to the work that we need to do, being honest with ourselves and giving ourselves, permission to start tasks now, or if it's going to be something where, a person wasn't in the mindset or wasn't currently ready to do that task, to give themselves permission and schedule a time to do it intentionally, rather than spending that time worrying and increasing their stress level during that time. And so we also talked about the cues, so things that lead us to procrastination, behaviors that tend to increase procrastination, and ways to kind of combat those things. And then talking about rewards and giving ourselves some credit and some acknowledgement that we had completed something that was important to us, or a task that needed to be done, by spending time doing things that were also related to our self-care, that were meaningful or important to us. Next week's topic was cognitive coping. And so we referred back to the stress level and also talked about appraisals from the stress model during that week. Here it was important for us to focus specifically on the thoughts that are related to graduate school. So I would always give the handout that's pretty common about common cognitive distortions and asking people to review them and pick out the ones that they tend to fall into the most often. And this was a great opportunity, again, to normalize that in graduate school, a lot of people are thinking the same ways about their experience, and acknowledging that, you know, those things are common, but maybe not as helpful in getting things done or working toward our goals and what's important to us. And so we were able to kind of find the specific areas that were getting in our way, and then also kind of normalizing that a lot of people experience those. So here, even though it wasn't therapy, what we would also give people is cognitive, like thought records, and asking them to put down some of their thoughts on paper for a specific situation that was stressing them out, potentially from the last week. And people tended to find it helpful to identify as the ways they were thinking about a situation that was causing them stress, and troubleshooting ways to think more realistically or helpfully about those situations. This was an interesting activity every time because people would talk about ways they would be able to use these more effectively with clients now that they had filled one out for themselves, or they would bring in kind of tactics they had used with their own clients in ways that they found to explain it or to address stressful thoughts or situations based on their own knowledge and their experiences. And we asked, again, just because of the nature of the group, that people only shared if they felt comfortable doing so. So we didn't want this to be a situation where people felt they had to share, or that they needed to give people more information than they were willing or comfortable with sharing with them. Then we followed up, so kind of reflected on this activity. So what was it like to put down your thoughts onto paper? What was it like to examine whether or not you thought your new thoughts were believable? And if that's okay, if it's about, you know, making your mindset completely different, or if it's just reducing attachment to those thoughts or giving yourself some space or distance from that. So we would go into, again, expectations for clients that we were working with, and how difficult it could be to complete an activity like this, potentially in areas that they could get stuck. So this was one where I think people found it pretty helpful to talk about, especially if they were earlier on in graduate school, ways that they could start using some of these techniques with clients. And again, with this too, we talked about the relationship between these thoughts and their experiences of stress or anxiety in graduate school, and ways to start changing those up a little bit.
So week 8 was all about self-compassion. Now, self-compassion is an extension of mindfulness. So Kristen Neff is someone who has done a lot of work. She's written a lot of books and articles on self-compassion. And there is plenty of research on how self-compassion can help with stress and self-criticism, anxiety, depression. So we incorporated self-compassion in COPE because of the research that's out there that supports the effectiveness of self-compassion on mental health. So self-compassion has 3 main components. The first one is self-kindness. So very simply put, it's being kind to yourself, because we are very quick as humans to beat ourselves up about the tiniest of things, and we engage in a lot of self-criticism because sometimes we all kind of are in this pursuit of perfectionism, and that can be really painful. That makes it easier for us to beat ourselves up. So self-kindness is the first component. Common humanity is the belief that I'm not alone in my pain, and there are other people who experience anxiety or stress or burnout. So that kind of gives you some support to cope with what you're experiencing. And finally, mindfulness is non-judgmental awareness of the present. So put together, these 3 components help us develop self-compassion. Now, there's a lot of research on how a lot of graduate students tend to experience burnout at the end of their programs. So burnout is a result of chronic stress and is characterized by emotional exhaustion, feeling depersonalized, or like feeling very like cut off from everything and feeling ineffective, feeling like you're not good enough. So burnout can be pretty intense, especially if you're not very consistent with your self-care routine. So engaging in self-compassion can potentially buffer or protect you from the effects of burnout. We also incorporated a discussion on compassion fatigue because a lot of our students and we as counselors also work with clients experiencing really intense trauma, and that can have an effect on our emotional and our mental well-being as well, because we absorb some of the trauma that our client is presenting with. So we had a really great discussion on compassion fatigue and burnout. And as far as experiential activities are concerned, we did a self-compassion diary. Now, Kristen Neff has a really great website on self-compassion that has a lot of resources and handouts, so we use that. And we also discussed how do you respond to a friend that is experiencing emotional pain. We always go all out to help our friends and our family that we know need our support, especially when they're struggling. But when we are struggling, we're more likely to beat ourselves up than to find support for ourselves. So we kind of discussed that disconnect between helping others and helping ourselves, and encouraged our participants to engage in some self-compassion on a day-to-day basis by maintaining something known as a self-compassion diary. And all of that is on Kristen Neff's website. Next, week 9, we talked about the concept of flow. Now, flow is a part of positive psychology and was developed by Csikszentmihalyi. And flow is being able to gain that inner clarity, being in the present moment. And even when you're working or you're engaging in an activity, you kind of make space to make it intrinsically rewarding for you. So we discussed the concept of flow and how can flow be incorporated into our day-to-day lives. So we had a handout on achieving flow states and some exercises as well that can help our participants engage or experience flow, because that makes work more rewarding, and that also makes play and fun stuff more rewarding because you're present and you're making most of these positive experiences. And finally, we also used body scanning exercises, helping them identify where stress is excuse me, in their body, and helping them do these body scanning exercises to be more aware of where they hold stress so that they can release that and feel more free, making it easier for them to achieve a flow state. Finally, week 10, this is where we started our wrap up or termination process. Now, I noticed as a leader that my group members would actually meet early on before group and have a nice chat in one of our kind of hangout areas in the building, and then they would kind of come into the room and we would have cope. So they actually developed a very nice kind of cohort, like a social group, and we kind of wanted to encourage them to keep those connections even after we ended cope. So that was also a focus of a termination session, is that even though cope is now ending, we want you to continue engaging in that kind of social interaction and connections that you've developed through cope. And also we wanted to encourage them to continue working on their self-care goals, to not like quit because there's no cope group anymore that is keeping you accountable. We also normalized the ebb and flow of progress, and we discussed how there might be times where you kind of, you don't engage in your self-care, but don't beat yourselves up. Try and get back on your self-care plan. And it's okay if there are weeks or days when you don't engage in, if you don't follow your plan, and that's normal, but try and be non-judgmental and avoid being self-critical and continue your process of self-care. So it's just kind of going over our goals and everything that we talked about, celebrating the progress that they've made in COPE group, and kind of encouraging them to continue once COPE group ends. So a very kind of positive, supportive termination wrap-up session.
Some of the feedback we got, so at the end of every COPE group, we asked participants to complete surveys and to provide their responses about things they enjoyed about the program, things they would have done differently. And one of the primary responses we got was that they enjoyed the time they had to provide each other with social support, having some time to talk about the topic with each other and about their own personal experiences. And so often what we would do as we realized this was being a trend during the groups was to kind of prioritize our own lists of things and topics we would cover within the group. So asking them at the beginning, based on here's some of the things we could cover today, how would you like to prioritize those? If we need to cut something out, what would that be? And then kind of revisiting that throughout the group as we kind of monitor time to see what that would be like. We didn't want people to feel rushed on a topic, but also wanted to make sure we got to everything that was important to people. So some groups were more talkative than others and would want more of that processing time. Some groups were fairly quiet and preferred just to kind of do the activities for the week and move on from there. So it just depended on the group, and it's important to get a read on the group to figure out what their preferences are and what fits best for them. One comment that somebody made in their feedback was that the simple activities seemed more doable. So they found that the things they could incorporate in their day-to-day life were the ones that were the most helpful to them given the nature of graduate school and being able to implement things week to week. And so that was one comment that people found that really helpful, was to find things that were pretty simple, pretty straightforward, that they could do in a short amount of time if possible. Giving ample time to then practice those things in the meetings themselves was an important part, and one of the important pieces of feedback was the weeks that felt more rushed, where there was more content, people didn't feel they had enough time to really practice and get a hold on ways to incorporate those things into their own lives. And so one strategy to potentially help with that would be to ask the group if they wanted to spend an extra amount of time, so meeting for 90 minutes rather than 60, or an extra 15 minutes, depending on the day of the group, if people thought that would be helpful, depending on what they had going on after. So it's finding that balance, again, between the amount of things that people are trying to do in their day-to-day lives and prioritizing self-care and what they could get out of the group. Trying to find things that could be consistent, and so having things that they start at the beginning, so the self-care plans, the SMART goals, making sure to revisit those every week. Asking people at the beginning to commit to the group, and so the social support is really important. And just like any group format that we would have, it's most helpful if people are able to start at the beginning with the same group and finish with that same group. So people found it really discouraging when people would leave the group halfway through or early on. In the online groups, we got the same feedback. So we would meet via Skype, and people would start to kind of trail off as the group went on because they weren't prioritizing things. And so asking people to commit at the beginning was helpful, and asking them to take time to prioritize it as part of their own self-care and their own well-being. And then also that commitment to their group members helped with accountability. People found the social support was really helpful. So just like we talk about social support as being an important part of the group, and one of the reasons that we started the group, participants tended to find this was one of the most helpful aspects of it as well. Again, finding that balance of when to hold the group. So some people's comments where they felt it was difficult to add another thing to their plate. It was difficult to find the time during the week and on the weekends. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that, it's the nature of this is that graduate school is busy and graduate students are stressed, and adding one more thing to their plate can be difficult. But then also helping them realize that it's, in their best interest, worthwhile, and to make the group worthwhile to them by prioritizing it and giving them the balance as you can. And then I'll let Yamini talk a little bit more about future directions and moving forward.
So some of our challenges, the biggest one was time commitment. So we graduate students are already pretty busy. We have a lot going on. So that was our biggest issue. And that was something that led to dropout from our COPE group. And also the boundary between a peer group and support and group therapy. So this is something that Craig kind of went over, where we had to be very careful that this doesn't turn into like a therapy group, which would be problematic. So we tried to, as leaders, we also were participants in the group. So it's not like this up-down kind of power dynamic between leaders and participants. We were also a part of group. So we kept it as a peer support group. Now, in the future, we would hope that departments can offer COPE as a 1-credit-hour course, even if it's in person or online. That would provide some impetus for students to remain in group, and maybe could encourage them to participate more consistently in COPE versus something that's voluntary. And then we also would like to get more departmental support. Though we talk about self-care in our graduate programs, there's very little that departments do in order to facilitate this self-care. So maybe encouraging more departments to adopt a program like COPE would be helpful. And then finally, our long-term goal is to help other universities adopt COPE. So if you would like to introduce COPE to your departments, please let us know and we can share some of our resources with you. So that was our last slide. So now we can take some of your questions.
Looks like one question that someone had was about spreading the word and getting people involved in COPE. Mm-hmm. And so at the beginning or shortly before every semester that we were going to have COPE, we would send out an email to our department inviting students to participate per requests from other departments, and through just kind of discussing what could be helpful. We would send them out to other mental health departments as well. So our university has a clinical psychology program that's separate from the counseling psychology program and from the social psychology program. And so what we would do is find potentially interested departments and send out emails to them. We would put up flyers in common spaces in our department so that graduate students knew that they could sign up for the group, and provided our email addresses so they could ask questions if they had them. When we did the online group through Blackboard, and when we were doing it through Student Affiliates of 17, we put out calls on listservs, had people sign up through doodle polls, and then kind of just took people on a first come first served basis for who we could get into the groups. And so we tried to take an approach that would get us as many people that would be interested as possible by spreading the word that way.
We also went into classrooms at Ball State. So we went to our practicum internship classes, our multicultural classes, so where we could get master's students, doctoral students. So we actually went in and so that they can see who's actually running the program, and we could also answer questions that way. We also got some support from Cake Rep, and they put up our flyer on their Facebook page. So we were able to get, like Craig said, we tried all different ways to advertise COPE.
Thank you, Craig and Yamini. We have a few more minutes, so maybe we could get to one more question. One other question that we had was wondering how you think the dynamic of the group might change if a faculty member was involved to facilitate. Do you think this would show students that faculty really care about self-care, or might it be detrimental to the group dynamic? And is this something you ever considered or tried?
We never really considered a faculty member running group, but at Ball State, our faculty members helped us with the advertising process. So they, some of them gave out flyers to their classes, or some of them even talked to their classes about COPE. So they were involved in that way, because we felt that involving a faculty member might bring in some power dynamics that might be a little uncomfortable for our students, might even prevent them from opening up in group or sharing. So we felt that having someone who is, in your peer group might make things more comfortable in group. Craig, what do you think?
Yeah, I think along the same lines. I think a key part of this too is that we had a faculty supervisor who, for each of the doctoral students that was facilitating the group, we had them as a resource to talk to and kind of share things with on a week-to-week basis. So I think that showed the faculty support for the group itself without throwing off the power differential and power dynamic in the room. So I think it gave a good balance of showing that faculty members cared and were willing to spend their time on the group without having somebody in the room that might make people less likely to share.
Okay. Well, it looks like it's about time for us to wrap things up. So I just want to take a minute again to thank you both for presenting today. Really appreciate it. And I'd like to just thank all of our attendees as well. If you would like more information about the COPE group, you can go ahead and send an email to the SAS Prevention Pillar email, which I believe I had put on the slide that had the information about myself. It's just sas.preventionpillar@gmail.com. And as I mentioned, this will be available. The recording will be on the SCP website soon. So you can check for that if you're wanting to rewatch parts of this. Or for those of you who are unable to join us today, those individuals can access this later. So thanks so much again, and I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.